for Jesus. Jesus is the suffering King, and he calls us to follow him even on the path of suffering, for us to take up our cross and even lay down our lives. So let me ask you again, would you give up your life for Jesus? Jesus' question is the same to us as to his disciples. Today, Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And nothing reveals that answer more clearly than whether we are willing to give our lives for him. Let me show you a little bit what that looked like with three people who said yes to that question. An old man in Rome called Polycarp in 155 AD. He was an elderly Christian bishop, and he was dragged before the Roman governor and told to deny Jesus. But he refused, and he said these words. He said, "These 86 years I have served him, and he has never done me any wrong. How could I blaspheme my king who saved me?" And so they burned Polycarp at the stake. Or another, the scholar in England, William Tyndale, in 1536. He translated the Bible into English so that ordinary people could read God's words just like we do today. And for that crime, he was strangled and burned. His final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Third person who said yes, a teenage girl at a school, Rachel Scott. In 1999, she was sitting outside her high school in Colorado when two armed classmates approached. They mocked her faith and asked her if she still believed in God. And she said, yes, and they shot her. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Would you? In today's passage, Jesus explains who he really is and shows us that unless we're willing to give up our lives for him, we haven't truly understood who he is. He puts the question to the disciples and to us. Now, of course, most Christians would say, yes, I'd give up my life for Jesus if it came to that, and I hope I would too. But the truth is, most of us don't really expect that kind of moment to come. But in reality, we are constantly faced with opportunities to give up our lives for Jesus. In small ways, we have to make thousands of little choices. In medium ways, dozens of more important choices about whether to give up our lives for Jesus. Now, we may never find ourselves face to face with a gunman, but we are making those small daily decisions, those medium decisions, and those large decisions for Jesus. We will be ready if that day ever comes. And in this passage, Jesus is preparing his disciples and us for that very reality. And we're going to see this unfold in 3 points today. First, who do you say I am? Jesus is the King. We'll see that if he is the King, we'll, in our second point, ask the question, well, do you really want a suffering king? Many people will follow a king into battle, but follow a king into suffering? Is Jesus the King the disciples or us really want? And thirdly, we'll see the King who calls you to die. Finally, we'll see Jesus explain that to recognize him as King means to give up our lives, but that actually in giving up our lives, it's the only way to save them, to have Jesus save them. So our first point, who do you say I am? We'll begin at verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went into the villages around Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked them, who do people say that I am? They replied, well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others still one of the prophets. You see, in those days, everyone was asking, who is Jesus? He was a bit of a celebrity, well known. Crowds came and crushed him. And Jesus says to his disciples, what have they heard people saying about him? Some say he was John the Baptist who'd been resurrected from the dead. Others said he was Elijah, the prophet who never died. And you know, on a multi-choice quiz, how there's this, and then it has kind of other at the bottom if you're not quite sure. Sounds like some people were just going, other. He's an other prophet. But what people can't miss is that there is something special about Jesus. In fact, even today, people can acknowledge that there is something special about Jesus. There was a book written called Who's Bigger, written by some computer scientists, Stephen, and a Google engineer, Charles. And what they did is they crunched who is the most influential person in history. They looked at, how long their Wikipedia, how much was written about them throughout history. And their research found that Jesus of Nazareth is ranked as number one. He is the most significant person in history. It says in their book, as the dominant figure in human history, Jesus, of course, is the most significant figure in our ranking. So people have always had something to say about Jesus. In those days that he was a prophet, and today even as well. People might say things like, Jesus, he was just a good teacher. But what about you? Who do you say Jesus is? And this is exactly the question that Jesus asked his disciples in verse 29. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say that I am? Now, at first, it seems like Jesus is asking them, pick one of those familiar options, some kind of prophet. But here, Peter gives a surprising answer and says something completely different. Peter answered, you are the Messiah, or the Christ. Peter says, Jesus, you're not a prophet, you're a king, the special promised Messiah. You see, Peter's answer here is amazing because it shows that it's finally kind of twigged for him. All that Jesus has done is now sunk in for Peter. He remembers Jesus going to announce the good news, the big news of God's kingdom, and it's dawned on him, the good news of the kingdom, Jesus is the king. I imagine that when Peter said this, he was probably pretty thrilled by this. Jesus, you're the Messiah, the king. You see, Peter and God's people, they would have been waiting for God to send the special promised king for a long time. In fact, the Old Testament had built up expectations. Back in 2 Samuel 7, God promised King David that a special king would come from his line. And in Psalm 2, the national anthem of Israel, God promises that his king will rule the nations with power and justice. It's not over the top to say that the disciples would have grown up hearing, every time the Romans would tax them, every time their people would be oppressed, their parents would have said to them, one day, kids, one day God's king will come to save us from the Romans and rule the world. For Peter and for the disciples, it was a little bit like winning the lottery. This meant freedom, power, glory. And for them personally, they were best friends with this new king. But more on their expectations later. It's worth noting here that Jesus doesn't correct Peter, he agrees. Because after all, we've been asking, what does everyone think about Jesus? But it seems only fair to ask Jesus who he thinks he is. Does that seem fair to you? And here Jesus all but agrees, yes, I am the promised Messiah. I am the promised king. But he says something surprising in verse 30. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So why the secrecy? Well, because he wasn't the kind of king that they expected. We'll see more about that in a moment. But also, this was dangerous news. They already had a king, King Herod, and he was paranoid and brutal. If King Herod heard that Jesus was calling himself the king, he would have had Jesus executed. And the Romans who controlled Israel, if they thought Jesus was going to lead a rebellion, they'd execute him too. But here Jesus is carefully keeping his identity as king hidden, first to avoid being executed before the right time, and second, because he doesn't want people like Peter to get carried away. He's not the kind of king they expect. He's a king who's come to suffer and die. But more on that in our second point. Let's apply this in two ways. Who is Jesus? Everyone needs an answer to that question. Who is Jesus? Just saying, I don't know, is not enough. Jesus is the most influential person who ever lived. Now, I've heard many people say, Jesus didn't even exist. In fact, a survey in England found that 4 out of 10 people thought Jesus was just a fictional character. But that's not true. All the historians agree Jesus was real. In fact, even Albert Einstein, who was no evangelical, he was no Sunday school believer, he describes how he could feel the presence of Jesus just reading the Gospels. Now, Albert Einstein, he's no fool. He's one of the smartest minds in modern history. When asked in an interview, did he accept the historical existence of Jesus, his reply was this. Einstein said, "Unquestionably. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates with every word. No myth is filled with such life. How different, for instance, is the impression that we receive from an account of legendary heroes from antiquity. Those heroes lack the type of authentic vitality of Jesus." So, this is an important topic. Everyone should have an answer to who is Jesus. Do you have an answer to who is Jesus? If not, why not be a little bit like Einstein and read the biographies of Jesus for yourself? I'd love to give you a copy of them. Or over Easter, after Easter, having 3 special afternoons called Hope Explored, a chance to discuss just this. So you yourself need an answer to this question, who is Jesus? But what about your family and friends? Do they have an answer to that question? And have you asked them? Sometimes it can feel a bit frightening for us to bring it up, but often I'm surprised again and again how willing people are to talk when you're willing to actually listen. That's the trick, isn't it? People are willing to talk when we're willing to listen. I often say to people, so what do you think about, God, spirituality and Jesus? And then try to listen well. And then try to ask a follow-up question, yeah, but what do you think about Jesus in particular? Now, often people will say things that you might not even agree with. That's okay, we're just listening. Because after you listen to someone, they often ask the same question of you, and then you can share. But of course, you've got to know what to say when they say who Jesus is. And so we've seen 2 ways we apply this. First, everyone needs an answer to who is Jesus. And secondly, who do you say Jesus is? Well, if you call yourself a Christian, as many of us here today do, it seems only fair to answer the question with, well, I say Jesus is who he says he is. And Jesus says he is the King, the special promised King. But as we're about to see, Jesus is not the kind of king that we expect. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, do we really want the kind of king Jesus is, a suffering king? In our second point, Jesus explains, he says, I am the suffering king who dies. Do we really want a king who bleeds before he reigns? Do we really want a king who dies before he rises? You see, at the end of the day, there really are only 3 possible answers to do we want a suffering king. The first is yes, but I don't really understand what that means. That's where the disciples are in the start of this. The second answer is no, that can't be right. Jesus can't be a king who suffers. This is what Peter comes up with when he rebukes Jesus. And then third, the final answer, Jesus explains that simply won't work. Yes, I want a suffering king. I need a king who will suffer in my place for my sin. Let's work our way through now and ask ourselves this question, do we really want a suffering king? First, verse 31. And then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. 3 things to notice here in what Jesus says. First, Jesus is doing some expectation setting. Have you ever met someone with really unrealistic expectations? Sometimes when I'm doing, pre-marriage counselling, I'll hear unrealistic expectations like, we're so in love, we'll never disagree. We don't need to do this conflict bit. And then I kind of have to helpfully be like, well, you're going to have to change your expectations or you're going to be in for a bit of a shock. The disciples, they had grand expectations. Jesus, he's the special king. He's going to take over the world. He's going to smash the Romans and we're going to be rich. And Jesus says, whoa, guys, That's not the plan. Let me change your expectations here. The second thing we notice is that Jesus explains that he is the suffering king. He says the Son of Man must suffer many things. The Son of Man is how Jesus talks about himself. Now, this would have been a shock to the disciples. Suffer? What do you mean suffer? You're the king. And thirdly, we notice that Jesus is really specific here about what will happen. Notice that. He says, rejected by the elders, the priests, the teachers, be killed, and then rise from the dead. In fact, in 32, we're told Jesus spoke to them plainly about this. Jesus often talks about his death in parables, but here he just straight out tells them, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, I am the suffering king. So the disciples and us are faced with the question, do we really want a suffering king? Peter answers the question with a very strong no. We read that Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. No, Jesus, says Peter, that is not the plan. But before we begin to put down Peter for being, somehow stupid, it's worth pointing out that if we were in Peter's shoes, we'd probably do the very same thing, right? Think about it. If Jesus is a king who suffers and dies, and we're going to become part of his kingdom, well, if the king is going to suffer, then, hey, we're probably going to have to suffer as well. Now, of course, there's plenty of Christian teachers out there who want to say, health and wealth, who tell you, oh no, Christians should never suffer. Oh, sure, Jesus might have suffered, but no, not for you. But here, even Peter is smarter than that. I mean, if the king suffers, so should we. It's a bit like if you go to a new workplace and the boss says, oh, I'm always suffering here, I'm working overtime, my office isn't air conditioned. You got to think to yourself, if the boss is suffering, well, you're probably going to suffer too. And Jesus makes crystal clear to Peter that this is the only way. He says that he must be killed. There is no other way than for Jesus to suffer. For Jesus to save us for what we deserve for our sin, he must suffer and die in our place. And Jesus explains this in 33. He turns and looks to his disciples. Jesus looks at his disciples to see if they're listening, so that when he rebukes Peter and us, we know that there is no other way. And then Jesus rebukes Peter with some of the strongest words in the whole Bible. He rebuked him, "Get behind me, Satan." Oh, those are strong words. Jesus is not saying that Peter is Satan, but this is exactly what Satan would say. He says, you have in mind that not the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. But Peter has in mind human ideas, that somehow God's special king would be above suffering and dying for his people. But God's king is a king who lays down his life. Jesus is the suffering, sacrificial king, and this is totally different to how our world thinks. Peter, like us, we think that, no, a king should make other people suffer. But Jesus says, no, I'm the one who will suffer. In fact, Peter thinks you're going to make the Romans suffer. But Jesus says, no, I will die, I will suffer to save the Romans, the very enemies that we hate. And so if we're going to follow a suffering king who sacrificed his life to save us, then as Jesus' kingdom advances, it does as his people sacrifice, as his people suffer, as they love and tell the world of Jesus. Even the great emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, he understood that Jesus' kingdom is a different one. Hear what Napoleon had to say about Jesus. He talks about other famous emperors. Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I have founded empires. But upon what did we rest the creation of our geniuses? Upon force. But Jesus Christ, he founded his empire upon love. And at this very hour, millions of men would die for him. Do you see what Napoleon was saying there? We've seen many empires and kings How did they rule the world? Through force, forcing people to die for them. How does Jesus rule the world? Through love. And today, millions, billions of people would willingly give their lives for Jesus. And so the question comes back, do you really want a suffering king? Because if we are followers of Jesus, then we must sacrifice as well for love. When someone wrongs us, in our family, in our workplace, in church, we must suffer instead of trying to get back at them or hold a grudge to forgive. Or when someone looks down on us for following Jesus, we sacrifice for love by continuing to pray and share. But if our King Jesus has suffered and died to love us, then of course we must follow him too into that suffering, which Jesus explains in our next point. Jesus is not just the king who suffers, he's the king who calls us to follow him even into death. Now, if someone was to ask me which AFL team I support, I guess I would probably say, St Kilda. Some of you are Queenslanders here, you look very confused. AFL, it stands for the Australian Football. Yeah, you know what I mean. Someone would say, well, why do you follow St Kilda? Look, basically, my mum was from Victoria and it was her team, and that's why I kind of nominally follow them. But if I'm honest, I'm really not that committed. I mean, if they made the grand final and then actually won it for once, then I'd tell everyone, oh yeah, I'm a St Kilda fan. I might even pay for a membership. But most of the time, I really don't care about St Kilda, if I'm perfectly honest. I'm a bit of a fair weather fan. But that made me think, what about being a Christian? Can someone say, yeah, I'm a Christian, all my family is, or I go to church sometimes. Oh, it's good when life's good, but when it costs something, my time, my reputation, my comfort, well, they just quietly kind of back away. But Jesus is clear here, if you're not all in, you're not in. In fact, Jesus shows actually, if you understand that Jesus is your suffering king who's given his life for you, then it's no loss for you to lose your life for him. We read in the next part, Jesus calls the crowd and the disciples, and he says to them something no one expected. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. This isn't comfortable discipleship. It's not self-help. This is a call to die. To follow Jesus is to deny yourself. In fact, Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. Hear those words again. Take up your cross. It's hard for us to really imagine just how shocking it would have been in those days for Jesus to say that. People's mouths would have opened. They would have looked away in disgust. You see, nowadays people sometimes talk about, oh yeah, I'm taking up my cross for Jesus as a small thing, as we take our dishes to the kitchen, I'm taking this is my cross to bear. But for Peter and everyone else there, they would have seen condemned prisoners carrying the bar of their cross that they would be killed on all the way up the hill for a public, humiliating crucifixion. But the cross is for all who follow Christ, and Christ leads the procession as he carries his cross, and we, his followers, tread in his footsteps, carrying our crosses as we march to our death. To follow Jesus means to deny yourself, but remember, he denied himself first. He left the glory of heaven, became a servant, and obeyed his Father even to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus doesn't call us to a path he hasn't walked himself. He took up his cross, not just as an example to us, but as a substitute for us. He bore the full weight of our sin, our shame, our judgment, so that we could be free. But Jesus explains this in verse 35. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. Jesus explains losers are keepers. Losers are keepers. To lose our lives for him and his royal gospel is to actually save our lives. But let's be honest, nothing could be more opposed to the spirit of our age. Our world says, look out for you, save yourself, pamper yourself, live for yourself. Just look at the ad campaigns that advertises to us, right? But our society inevitably becomes a society of losers. Those who in the end lose what really matters, their lives, their souls. Because in 36 and 37, we truly are already lost. Jesus said, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? You see, we really have no choice. Your life is already lost. You might gain the whole world, but because of our sin and our rebellion against God, our lives are already lost. In fact, let me tell you about two men who gained, one who gained everything and one who lost everything and gained more. The first one was a man that we'll meet in his final years, W. Somerset. He was one of the most celebrated writers of the 1930s. He was fabulously wealthy, and he found himself surrounded by luxury, but gripped by fear and emptiness. His nephew tells the story of going to visit him in his villa on the Mediterranean. He's got a staff of 11, lavish meals, nothing is missed. But his nephew found him hunched over a Bible, reflecting bitterly on this very verse. He read it and said, "What shall it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his own soul?" And this rich man, he says, that's bunk. The terror faced him, though, left him with a deep unrest. This man was rich. He had everything the world offered, and yet he died as a man who lost what mattered most. Now let me tell you about a second man, a man who lost everything and gained more than the world could offer. This man's name was Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot, he was a bright young man full of promise. He graduated with honours and he was engaged to a godly woman. He had the kind of gifts in life that he could go anywhere, do anything. But he believed that Jesus was worth more than safety, comfort or career. He gave it all up to reach an unreached tribe deep in the jungles of Ecuador. And at just 28 years old, he was speared to death by the very people he'd loved and come to serve. Now imagine how our world does the maths on those two guys. The first man had everything, but Jim Elliot lost everything. But in the eyes of Jesus, he gained everything. There are some haunting words in Jim Elliot's journal that say just this. Jim Elliot wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." Jim Elliot staked his life on that truth, and he did not lose. If Jesus is king, we must commit ourselves to him. Now, we often think of the cross as just the physical pain, but it was also shame and embarrassment. People were crucified naked. Taking up our cross to follow Jesus is signing up to be shameful in the world's eyes. Becoming a Christian is signing up to a life of embarrassment. And after all, to become a Christian is to admit, most embarrassing of all, hey, I've stuffed up. I'm not everything I should be. If I'm perfectly honest, I can't save myself. I'm not a good person deep down. And I'm going to publicly tell everyone and God that. But hear these words of Jesus in 38. "If anyone's ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels." See, Jesus is clear here. To follow him means shame. People looked down on Christians in those days and even killed them. And people look down on Christians today. Think of Jim Elliot, or think of Rachel Scott, or the others who died for Jesus. What a waste, people would say. But Jesus is the King, God's promised Messiah, so we must commit ourselves to him, even if it means suffering and shame. But here's the comfort. Jesus didn't just suffer and die, he rose again. He was vindicated, and he promises that when we follow him, we will be vindicated too. Yes, following Jesus may mean embarrassment and rejection now, or even loss or persecution. But he says those who lose their lives for him, it will save. And when the Son of Man comes in his glory with the holy angels, on that day, every sacrifice, every shameful moment, every hidden act of obedience will be revealed and honoured. That's the encouragement. That's the path of the cross that ends in a crown. That's the way of death that leads to life. Our suffering King will return, not in weakness, but in glory. And so, if you've ever been ashamed in Jesus, and we all have, we must remember that he was never ashamed to hang on the cross for you. And if you trust him on that last day when he returns, he will not be ashamed of you. Our suffering King goes before us. He bore our sin, endured our shame, and now reigns for our glory. And so, church family, let's take up our cross. Let's follow him, because it will all be worth it. Let's pray.